tell you that I've been uncomfortable for a long time. I suspect that a lot of white people have been uncomfortable for a long time. I'll tell you that I'm scared to have this conversation because I don't know enough, and I'm scared of the potential attack on exploring those issues because I feel it's something I should know, and the fact that I don't know means that I'll be called out for not knowing. And so I think it is exactly what I've articulated many white people in our country feel, which is just simply, rather than go there, I'm going to not go there. Welcome to Colourful, a podcast where Black and white people talk about their experiences and stories that have shaped who they are and who we understand one another to be. I am Stacy Jane, mom to my 2 adopted children. I live in Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm really hoping that this podcast is going to be a place that enables us to have conversations together rather than in siloed groups. I'm hoping it's going to take us from complacency to connection, and I'm looking forward to being on that journey with you. There's so much to discuss here, and so I want to start from the initial standpoint that I know I know that we need to have conversations that are going to be deep and heavy, the type of conversations that allow us to understand each other better, that lead to growth. I'm also hoping that this can be a place where we spend some time enjoying the lighter side of life and some of the funnier stories that we have about each other. And actually one of them that I heard recently, which I thought was incredibly funny, was when a Black friend of mine shared that it's fascinating how white people are happy to say tsunami, but they can't say tsepo, and that comes out as shepo. So I think that's one of those examples where we can laugh about things, but also there's a big story in that, and it's kind of like stand up and shape up. And that's what I'm hoping that we're going to do in this particular space. As you will notice, I have a very beautiful face here in the room with me on our introductory episode. This is Sena. Sena, thanks for joining. And I know you're going to take some time to introduce yourself just now, but what I want to start this podcast with is something that you posed to me a couple of months ago when I started talking to you about wanting to launch this podcast. Can you ask me that question here, please?
Stacy, I asked you, why would I want to listen to a white woman talk about race?
So, Sena, thank you for asking me that question, because it is fundamental to the direction that we're going to take on this podcast. And I think if we didn't address that question in our very first episode, then it would lead to the very expected and warranted eye-rolling and exasperation that could be the product of a white woman standing on a soapbox, which is absolutely not what I want to do with this podcast, because I am very understanding of the fact that I am operating from a position of privilege. And so that will inform the entire direction that my mind takes when I engage with a topic such as race. So this introductory episode is going to set the tone for the entire podcast series that we have. And this episode is going to focus on exactly why it is that a white woman is talking about race. And I have my colleague, who has now become a friend and a mentor in this space, who is joining me today. And she is going to be asking me some of the hard questions, the types of questions that are going to very likely expose my blind spots, areas that I have yet to grow, things that I don't know. I have to admit I am a little bit fearful because the questions that Sena is going to ask to me today are unscripted. So I have no idea what's to come. We have obviously had conversations over the months that we have been working on this podcast together. And so she understands my standpoint and I understand hers. But we decided that we wanted to be really authentic in the way that we share this content with you. And our hope is that you can understand that we are being very vulnerable and very real in this space, and that I'm willing to have these conversations. And my objective here is for me to be challenged by Black people, to kind of shock white people out of their complacency. And I'm also hoping for some grace from both Black and white people as we navigate what I hope is a path that we're going to do together without sounding overly superficial. I do mean that I hope we can have real conversations. And in fact, I listened to a podcast by Trevor Noah recently, and he was saying that people rarely have those deep, defining conversations and debates any longer, and they end up squabbling in social posts. And so what I want to do is move away from that anger. I'm not saying there won't be anger, there probably will, but I want to move away from the anger that happens in social posts and bring that conversation into a bigger realm where we get to potentially connect over issues that we don't understand. So Sena, that is my introduction for the podcast, and I thank you for joining me. And perhaps you want to share a little bit about yourself before you start interviewing me.
Hi, Stacy. Thank you for having me on your platform. As you mentioned before, you and I are colleagues that quickly turned to friends. And now we sort of have this mutual adoration and respect for each other on a fundamental level. Just a little bit about myself is that I am passionate about social justice. And I've spent a large chunk of my young adult life and my academic career and even a bit of my professional life really studying power dynamics and in particular race dynamics in this country. I engage with it on a daily basis through lived experience and also from a theoretical lens. And so this is a subject matter that I would like to consider myself well versed in, but also a subject matter that I'm quite passionate about it and has real life implications for me and people that look like me. I don't profess to be the mouthpiece for Black people everywhere. Being Black is not a singular experience. I just have a very particular perspective on it, and I acknowledge that that may differ from a lot of other people. But I appreciate being in part of discussion like this and helping guide and shape discussions like this because I think they are so invaluable and I think they are so important. And Stacy, I also value you as an ally. And I think this is what I believe effective allyship to be, is using your power to advocate for the less powerful and going into the spaces that you know that disadvantaged groups would not be able to otherwise access and spreading that message. And so it is an honor to be on this podcast with you today. When you initially told me about this podcast a few months ago, I felt conflicted. You told me that you wanted to speak and have a platform discussing race relations within the context of South Africa and, the greater world. And I was worried because I questioned the viability and, the impact of what you're trying to achieve here. I wondered whether or not you understood the gravity of the can of worms that you were opening up. I wonder whether you understood how inextricably linked the conversation like this is with trauma, hurt, anger, and emotion. And I knew that by you being the one to open up the space, you were also going to be on the receiving end of very complex dynamics and very complex emotions. And I just wondered whether or not you understood the gravity of what you were trying to achieve with this podcast. I also wondered whether you had sufficiently reckoned with your own privilege and whether you had come to understand and were willing to truly listen to the plight of people who have faced discrimination and various hardships because of the color of their skin. And I wondered how you could relate to that as somebody who has never faced a day of hardship in their life because of the color of their skin. And so I worried and I questioned and we debated and we listened to each other. And fast forward to now, I can say that I know your intentions beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I'm also mindful about how this could play out on the greater stage. And so I'm going to go there, and we are going to go there, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it may be difficult, but I know that you will, we have created a safe space here where we can be honest and we can challenge each other, but most importantly, we can listen with empathy. And so I'm really excited to get into this with you today. So, Stacy, you spoke about reckoning with your own privilege, and you spoke about really being at a place in your life where you are interrogating these things and you can no longer keep silent and you want to have these conversations, as uncomfortable as it may be. And I guess my question is that you have gone through your whole life, comfortable, white woman, suburban life, privileged, and you are 30, 39, and you've lived a life where you have never faced discrimination because of the color of your skin. So my question to you is, why now? And I guess, to put it more bluntly, what took you so long?
I don't know that I even have an answer to that, Sena. I'll tell you that I have always felt uncomfortable about it. Obviously, when you're growing up as a child, you only see what you see. So as a child, I probably didn't even know what was happening. There were a couple of years that I spent out the country, and I came back after 94. So there was a lot that I wasn't exposed to. Having said that, when I got into the country, it was very clearly that there were white schools and black schools. And I had no black friends. Later on, we started having black people come to our school. I always felt it was strange that there were so many white people and so few black people. And I also felt uncomfortable with the fact that black people would stay together and white people would stay together. I remember a particular incident where there was a friend of mine who was friends with one of the black girls, and she had her afro hair instead of, I don't know, braids or whatever. And so this friend of mine, in what I think she meant was like a loving way, she started referring to her hair as popcorn, and then she started calling her popcorn as an actual name. And I remember feeling really uncomfortable with that, but I didn't know why. I just thought, but that's not her name. Why are we calling her popcorn? And I could tell it made her uncomfortable. So I don't know what's taken me so long, Sena. I'll tell you that I've been uncomfortable for a long time. I suspect that a lot of white people have been uncomfortable for a long time. I'll tell you that I'm scared to have this conversation because I don't know enough. And I'm scared of the potential attack on exploring those issues because I feel it's something I should know. And the fact that I don't know means that I'll be called out for not knowing. And so I think it is exactly what I've articulated many white people in our country feel, which is just simply, rather than go there, I'm going to not go there. And so it's just complacency, and I should have done it sooner and I didn't. When I talk about realizing that there was something that made me uncomfortable, if I actually articulate what it is, it's probably white guilt, which is, it's a very real feeling that I think a lot of white people feel. But my issue with it is that we don't really take it any further than that. We're not using that as a prompt to engage in content, have conversations, watch shows that look different to every show that we ever watch, buy our children different books that show representation on the playground. White guilt in itself is absolutely pointless. And I have seen that a lot of the result of white guilt is the support of charities. And I think that's great. Like, don't not support a charity, but don't think that that's where it should end, because there is a bigger conversation about changing the way we interact with one another that needs to be had. It's not about saving the starving children. The starving children are the product of both social and racial issues, and they need to be supported regardless of their skin color. But that's not helping us progress forward with a conversation that's going to start connecting us.
Thank you for that. And that's very honest. And I think that's exactly the kind of honesty we need in order to have these robust conversations. I think white people may be struggling with, how they're perceived with their honesty versus like the impact of what that honest conversation could open up and the change that it could precipitate. So thank you for that honesty. Stacy, those people or those of your followers that follow you on social media may know that you adopted 2 beautiful black children. And so the question is going to come up, and I think that it's important to address on this platform is, did adopting black children change your perspective and your why now have anything to do with that? Does that make it more pressing for you? Are the stakes higher for you? And what did adopting those beautiful children do for you in terms of your engagement with race relations?
Quite honestly, in the very early stage, so my children are 8 and 6. I've adopted them when they were 4 months old. So they've been with me for most of their life. And in the very beginning, I say the very beginning, it was probably the first 2 years, I had no intention of engaging in conversations about our skin colors being different. I was very much of the opinion that I knew we were a mixed race family, and I made every intention of making sure that we have representative toys in the house, that we have stories that talk to adoption, stories that talk to white people, brown people, LGBTQ. But I didn't engage in the conversation about black versus white, and I still felt uncomfortable in those times. So I don't think that having the children was the catalyst to engaging in these conversations. But what I can tell you is that I am acutely aware of the fact that they are going to be experiencing life in a very different way to the life that I experienced, because even though they're going to be coming from a quasi-privileged position, they're still going to be doing it in black skin. And when they say to me one day, when they're teenagers and stamp their foot and say, Mom, you don't understand me, I'm going to be in the unique position to say I probably don't, and I never will. And they're going to be grappling with things like language differences. They're going to be at pick and pay, and if they've only been taught English, the closer lady is going to be confused when she says hi to them and they don't respond with Molo, and they respond with, hello. I want to engage in these conversations so that I can help my children to navigate life, but I have no expectations that I'm going to be able to do that in the way they need me to. So the short answer is they have been a part of this journey rather than the catalyst for the journey. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Sena?
Yes, it does answer my question. I think to that, Stacy, I have a follow-up. It sounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you came from a place of, I see no color, right? Because it never, like almost colorblind. And I can understand, and this is why I would like you to unpack that more, because I think there's other white people sitting at home who I hear so often is, I don't see color. I don't want to talk about race because it has no bearing. I don't believe in that. I am colorblind. And I'm wondering if you understand now, and perhaps you may not have understood then, that in and of itself was some erasure of a real experience. To say you don't see color, or to say as good as well-meaning as it is actually very harmful, because it's almost gaslighting people of color about the real experience because they live the difference. Did you realize then that your stance, at what point did it transform for you and you realized that your stance of I don't see color or we are all equal in my eyes was actually doing the opposite of what you intended it to do?
So I also have a personal hatred of that statement, that I don't see color. And my worst is actually when my very well-intentioned friends would say that of my little babies, because I was like, well, the fact that you're saying that means that you do see color. So it's a really stupid statement. So I appreciate that. And actually, it wasn't that I didn't see color. It was that I was thinking about it from my perspective. So they were black children and into a white family. So obviously our extended family, grandparents, aunts and uncles, they're all white. So for me, it was about bringing their blackness into my whiteness and trying to figure out if I could create a new culture and history for them, being from my perspective. So it wasn't about being colorblind. It was about almost turning them into white people. Yet I was very much acknowledging the fact that they were not white people, they were black people. And I didn't know how to show up as a mixed race family because all I know is how to show up as a white family. Now, the flip side of it is I need to show up as a white mother to black children in a system that has been created by white people. So it's now kind of flipped on its head, and I'm trying to think. In fact, I sometimes find myself trying to be a bit black. I don't know what that means exactly, and that's desperately stereotypical. But like sometimes I find myself wanting to like engage in music types that a typical black person, which I realize is a huge stereotype to say, but I almost want to be a little bit more in that space so that I'm less in the white space, so that I can start to show up as a black person in a white world, which makes no sense. But yeah.
Stacey, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. It sounds like there is a part of you, and when you say, I mean, it's funny because you're like, I try to almost be in black spaces. It sounds, I've had experiences with friends who are on a similar journey that you are on now, where I found that they try to overcompensate or sort of feel some kind of need to be away from your typical white spaces. So I think it comes from a place of genuinely wanting to connect with people of color. So I think that the experience that you're speaking to is really is unique in the sense that, you know, it's happening in your world, but it's very relatable. And I think that the many listeners are going to be able to relate to what you just said there. So thank you. Stacy, I want to move on to your, again, formative years. You touched on your relationship with race relations and how you conceptualized and understood race from being in the school system. And I want to move it a little bit more to your young adult life. So I know this about you. You attended Rhodes University. Can you tell the audience when you went to Rhodes?
Oh, well, you've already given away my age, so sure. So I graduated in 2006. So I was there from 2003 to some point in 2007.
Amazing. I too went to Rhodes. And, when we speak about it, and I said this to you the other day, is that, Stacey, I think at the time that you went to Rhodes and the time that I went to Rhodes is such different times in the sense that being in a place for me that was so multicultural and so rich really, really expanded my worldview and actually propelled me to engage with these things on a more even academic level. It really inspired me to engage with societal dynamics and, systemic oppression from an academic lens, just because the space was so conducive to that. But from speaking to you, it sounds like you had a very different experience.
I'm very unproud of my answer on this, Sena. I didn't engage in multicultural relationships or experiences. I didn't open my eyes at all. I could have, because it would have been the first real opportunity to look into different lives, because I would have been overly exposed to a white life in school, as you pointed out. And I just carried my life right over into university. I did all the things that I believe white people are known for. Long nights at the Rat, lots and lots of drinking and partying. I did all the things that I stereotypically should have done. I do have one memory of during the time of studying for exams. I remember thinking there were so many black people there, and I thought, where are all these black people? Like, I don't see them. And I really didn't understand. I actually didn't know that there were so many black people at my university. That's how little I knew. Because typically they didn't go out the way we did. They were studying really hard and working really hard to lift themselves out of their circumstances, create new lives, all those sorts of things. Whereas I'd already started out with that life. I didn't, I knew how to make a system work for me. So yeah, I studied hard. Of course I studied hard. But being able to study hard or work hard, everybody can do that. My position of privilege allowed me to work the system so that I could study and play. And of course I would have had the funds to do that too. So I'm not saying I was rolling in money, but I certainly had more than many people would have had. And yeah, I'm pretty ashamed of my answer, but there you go.
I think, Stacey, I don't think there's any reason to have any shame about that. The reason I asked that question is because I find that even in spaces where, it's so obviously diverse, and I think of university spaces as really being representative of the demographic of the country, it's almost like I always question, and I'm sure the audience question as well, how are white people in South Africa able to go into spaces like that and leave completely unaffected? How do you still manage to stay in silos? And I think the answer that you gave there really just, speaks to the power dynamics and the privilege that you have, and the privilege to look away and the privilege to not engage, while being oblivious that your experience, someone else's experience, is so polar opposite from yours, and the stakes are much higher than in that space. So I think that's that question. I appreciate that vulnerability, because it really will lead us to question these things more.
I also just want to make one sort of point there, Sena, as well, is so that was my perspective as a white person. Equally, it can be said for different race groups as well. We often find different races sticking together because their histories, their contexts, and their cultures are the same. So there is definitely a case to be said for burying your head in the sand, being complacent, ignoring reality. But there's also the point that we just find relief in being with people like us, and that's just a product of the world. And that's exactly why I want to have these kind of conversations, is because I want us to be able to do that more, like kind of cross those divides through honesty and through awareness, because they are easier.
I completely agree with you, Stacy. We tend to gravitate towards what we know. So the podcast. Okay, so you are taking this discussion very divisive, and others would argue inflammatory, but ultimately, I think, very constructive. Now, for a woman who is on a journey, again, to reckon with her own privilege and questioning these things relatively, recently, why a podcast, Stacy? If somebody asked, well, why not write an article? Why not write a book? Why not go into white spaces and have one-on-one conversations? And people who are skeptical and who are going to be like, well, why would you platform yourself in this way? Who made you the authority? So again, here's my question. Why a podcast, Stacy? Why do you think that this is the most effective way to spark this sort of conversation?
I speak in quite a few conferences and platforms naturally as a part of what I do in the working world. And I feel as though it's the type of platform that, especially because we're doing this as a visual podcast, it's the type of platform that has reach and that enables people to have wider conversations rather than the one-on-one at a bride. Which, by the way, obviously, if you are in a situation where you have the opportunity to speak to inequality and injustice, you got to take that opportunity. But I just feel like there is a bigger conversation to be had at a more national level, and I want to have those in a podcast space. I feel like it's a really good medium for that, which is why we've also chosen to do it as a visual podcast instead of purely audio, because I think it's a podcast about race, and we need to see one another in order to truly understand the emotion and understand the pain, the frustration, the anxiety, the fear, the confusion, the unconscious bias, which I'm no doubt will come out. We need to visually see those things, and the podcast is a format that enables that.
Okay, I am going to ask you now, Stacy, what are your fears with coming onto a platform, into this podcast platform, and speaking on what you are speaking about? What are you terrified of? I will tell you that when you told me about this, the first thing I thought about is that, my gosh, this woman's going to get canceled. So what are your fears? And I think it's important to be very honest and vulnerable with the audience that, as we're walking this journey, we understand, and you understand that it's high stakes. So what are your fears around speaking on this platform?
My fear is that people believe that I am coming at this from the perspective of somebody who knows anything, because I don't. I don't want to position myself as somebody who understands race. I'm trying to do the exact opposite. I'm someone who doesn't understand race, but I acknowledge the injustice, I acknowledge the privilege, and I want to understand my unconscious bias better, and I want to find the right tools to overcome that, to teach it to my children, but actually to just share it at a broader level. Another fear that I have is that this becomes a platform that is about teaching white people things, and that I really don't want it to be that. I want it to be a place where all people are having conversations. If it's going to be a platform where all people are having conversations, then naturally there is going to be high emotion, there's going to be high frustration, there's going to be people who are going to experience certain of the things that I say or certain of the things that come out in this space as being tone deaf, as being insensitive, as being superficial. So my fear is that people hold back on those things. I want you to tell me that stuff. Like, I need to hear it, because otherwise we just perpetuate a system that was the same. But what I do ask for is to clearly articulate your argument, because I want to have that conversation and I'm willing to take it. I'm willing to be exposed, but I would like to have it in a constructive kind of space, in a space that we both grow and learn from one another. But if we're talking about absolute fear, of course I'm terrified of being openly attacked and slandered on social media. It's happened already. But I hope that in the responses that I've given so far, I've shown that I'm not standing here talking about race. I'm talking about the fact that I don't know enough about race. And so I'm hoping that intentionality comes through in what will naturally be an emotive, frustrated, angry conversation. Thank you for joining us for our introductory episode. I hope that you found the conversation to be real and honest, and a good indication of the type of content that we're going to be exploring together in this space. If you did enjoy this episode, please do subscribe to the podcast and follow us on our social platforms. You can find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. And you can follow me on Instagram @_StacyJane_. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this journey with you.